On September 15, 1919, in a one-room schoolhouse outside Nashville, Tennessee, a teacher named Margaret Holloway assigned her 23 students an unusual writing exercise. Each child was instructed to write their own obituary, to imagine they had died, and to describe how their death had occurred, what age they had been, what they had accomplished in their lives, and how they would be remembered. The children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, completed the assignment with varying degrees of enthusiasm and skill, some writing elaborate narratives while others produced simple sentences describing their imagined deaths. Miss Holloway collected the obituaries, read them carefully, and filed them away in her desk drawer without further comment. The students thought it had been a strange assignment but didn't question it. Miss Holloway was known for unconventional teaching methods, and children in rural Tennessee schools in 1919 were trained to obey their teachers without asking why. The class moved on to other subjects, and the obituary exercise was forgotten by everyone except Miss Holloway, who kept those papers and apparently read them frequently over the following months. But between September 1919 and December 1921, all 23 students who had written those obituaries died, and they died exactly as they had written, at the ages they had predicted, from the causes they had described, in circumstances that matched their imagined narratives with precision that defied any rational explanation. A boy who had written that he would drown at age 9 drowned in a creek 3 months after his 9th birthday. A girl who had written that she would die of fever at 12 developed scarlet fever and died 2 weeks after turning 12. A student who had written that he would die in a barn fire perished in exactly that way, at exactly the age he had predicted, despite the fire being ruled accidental with no connection to Miss Holloway or to anyone who would have known about his written prediction. When the pattern was finally noticed by a local minister who had officiated at multiple funerals and who began comparing dates and causes of death to the school records he kept, the investigation that followed would uncover one of the most disturbing cases in American history, a case that challenged rational explanation, that suggested either impossible precognition by young children or something far more sinister involving a teacher who somehow knew or controlled when and how her students would die. And the question that haunted investigators and that remains unanswered today, did those children somehow know their own futures when they wrote those obituaries? Or did Margaret Holloway make their written predictions come true through methods that left no evidence, but that nevertheless resulted in 23 deaths over 27 months? Before we continue with the impossible story of Margaret Holloway and the 23 students whose written obituaries predicted their exact deaths, subscribe to Shadows of America and hit that notification bell. We release hour-long investigations every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Let us know in the comments what state you're watching from, because what happened in that Tennessee schoolhouse, and whether those deaths were prediction or murder or something that defies both categories, represents one of the most disturbing mysteries in American educational history. Rural Tennessee in 1919 was still recovering from the devastations of World War I and from the influenza pandemic of 1918 that had killed millions worldwide. The war had taken young men from farming communities, disrupting agriculture, and leaving families struggling with labor shortages. The pandemic had killed indiscriminately, claiming children, adults, and elderly with horrifying speed and leaving communities traumatized by waves of death that had peaked in late 1918 but that continued to claim lives through 1919 and into 1920 as weakened populations remained vulnerable to disease. The small community of Hillsborough, located about 20 miles south of Nashville in Williamson County, had a population of approximately 400 people in 1919. Most of them engaged in farming tobacco, corn, and livestock. The community had one church, one general store, and one school, a simple one-room wooden structure that served all school-age children in the surrounding area, typically enrolling between 20 and 30 students at any given time, depending on how many families could spare children from farm work to attend school. Margaret Holloway had been teaching at the Hillsborough School since 1912, having come to Tennessee from Virginia, where she had completed normal school training to become a teacher. Holloway was 42 years old in 1919, unmarried, and lived alone in a small house adjacent to the school property. She was known as a strict but effective teacher, someone who maintained discipline and who expected hard work from her students, but who also introduced them to literature, history, and ideas beyond the limited horizons of rural farm life. Holloway's teaching methods were sometimes unconventional by the standards of rural Tennessee education. She encouraged creative writing, had students perform dramatic readings, and incorporated current events and discussions of the wider world into her curriculum, rather than focusing solely on the rote memorization and practical skills that characterized most rural schooling. Some parents appreciated her progressive approach and believed their children were receiving better education than they themselves had received. But others were suspicious of her methods, viewing them as impractical or as potentially corrupting influences that might give children ideas above their station. The 23 students enrolled in Holloway's school in September 1919 came from 15 different families, most of them children of tenant farmers or small landowners who worked land in the hills and valleys around Hillsborough. The students' ages ranged from 6 to 14, as was typical for one-room schools, where multiple grade levels were taught simultaneously. The older students, particularly the boys, attended irregularly, missing school during planting and harvest seasons when they were needed for farm work. The younger children and girls attended more consistently, though their attendance was also affected by weather, family circumstances, and the various demands of rural life. The obituary assignment that Holloway gave her students on September 15, 1919, was framed as a creative writing exercise designed to help students practice narrative writing and descriptive language. Holloway explained that obituaries were a specific type of writing that required particular skills, summarizing a life, identifying important accomplishments, describing circumstances of death in ways that were factual but respectful. She told the students that by writing their own obituaries, they would learn these skills while also thinking about what they hoped to accomplish in their lives and how they wanted to be remembered. Some students approached the assignment playfully, imagining themselves dying at advanced ages after exciting lives filled with adventures and achievements they knew were unlikely for children of tenant farmers. Others took the assignment more seriously, writing obituaries that reflected the limited expectations and harsh realities of rural Tennessee life, imagining themselves dying young from disease or accident, being mourned by small circles of family and neighbors, leaving behind little except memories of having been good children who had helped their families. The obituaries the students wrote varied in length and sophistication based on their ages and writing abilities. The youngest children produced simple sentences. Mary Johnson died when she was 8. She had a fever. Her mother and father were sad. The older students wrote more elaborate narratives, some of them surprisingly mature and thoughtful in their reflections on mortality and on what made a life meaningful. Several students wrote about dying from diseases that had recently been prominent in the community: influenza, typhoid, scarlet fever, suggesting these were the causes of death most familiar and frightening to them. But what made these obituaries truly disturbing, in retrospect, was their specificity. Many students included precise ages at death, specific causes, and details about circumstances that seemed oddly concrete for what was supposed to be an imaginative exercise. A 10-year-old boy named James Patterson wrote that he would die at age 11 from drowning in Harpeth Creek while trying to save a younger child who had fallen in. A 12-year-old girl named Sarah Mitchell wrote that she would die at age 13 from fever that would come suddenly and would take her within days despite doctors' care. A 14-year-old boy named Robert Collins wrote that he would die at age 15 in a fire in his family's barn while trying to rescue livestock. These specific predictions might have been coincidences, children happening to imagine deaths that then occurred by chance, except that nearly all 23 students included specific ages and specific circumstances, and nearly all of those predictions came true with precision that exceeded any reasonable probability. If one or two students had died at ages they had predicted, that could be explained as tragic coincidence. But 23 students, all dying at predicted ages, from predicted causes in circumstances that matched their written narratives, that defied statistical possibility and suggested either impossible clairvoyance or deliberate orchestration by someone who had read those predictions and had made them come true. Margaret Holloway collected the obituaries after students completed them, spending several minutes reading each one carefully before placing them in a folder in her desk drawer. Several students later recalled that Holloway had seemed particularly focused on certain obituaries, reading them multiple times and making small marks in the margins, though no student could recall what those marks had been or what they might have meant. Holloway made no comments about the content of the obituaries beyond brief praise for students whose writing showed good narrative structure or descriptive detail. The class moved on to other subjects after the obituary exercise, and the students largely forgot about the assignment, but Holloway apparently did not forget. Multiple people who visited the school over the following months reported seeing Holloway reading papers from a folder during lunch breaks or after school hours, studying them with intense concentration. When asked what she was reading, Holloway would say only that she was reviewing student work, offering no details about which assignments she was studying or why she was reviewing them so repeatedly. The first death occurred in December 1919, 3 months after the obituary assignment. James Patterson, who had written that he would drown at age 11 while trying to save another child from Harpeth Creek, died exactly as he had predicted. James was walking home from school on December 18 when he saw a younger boy, his 6-year-old neighbor, fall through thin ice into the creek. James went into the water attempting to help the child but was pulled under by the current. Both boys drowned before adults who heard the commotion could reach them. The community mourned the tragedy, viewing James as a hero who had died trying to save another child. No one initially connected James's death to the obituary he had written 3 months earlier. The obituaries had been a minor classroom exercise, forgotten by everyone except perhaps Miss Holloway, and the circumstances of James's death seemed like a terrible accident rather than anything that could have been predicted or orchestrated. The adults who recovered the boys' bodies noted that the ice was unusually thin for mid-December, that the temperature had been warmer than normal, and that the boys shouldn't have been near the creek at all given how dangerous partially frozen water could be. The second death occurred in February 1920. Sarah Mitchell, who had written that she would die at 13 from sudden fever, developed scarlet fever 2 weeks after her 13th birthday. The disease progressed rapidly despite care from a local doctor, and Sarah died within 5 days of the first symptoms appearing. Again, the community grieved but saw nothing suspicious. Scarlet fever was a common cause of death among children, and Sarah's death, while tragic, seemed like natural misfortune rather than anything connected to a 3-word obituary she had written months earlier. But through the spring and summer of 1920, more of Holloway's students began dying, and the pattern of deaths matching predicted obituaries gradually became impossible to ignore. In April, a 9-year-old girl named Emma Louise Taylor died from pneumonia at exactly the age she had predicted in her obituary. In June, a 12-year-old boy named Thomas Brennan was killed when kicked by a horse, dying at the age and from the cause he had written about. In August, 2 students died within days of each other, one from typhoid fever and one from injuries sustained in a fall from a hayloft, both at ages and from causes that matched their written obituaries exactly. By September 1920, exactly 1 year after the obituary assignment, 8 of the 23 students who had completed the exercise were dead. Several parents were beginning to notice the correlation between the obituary assignment and the deaths of students who had participated. One mother, Mary Patterson, James Patterson's mother, went to the school and asked Miss Holloway if she still had the obituaries that students had written. Holloway claimed that she had thrown them away after grading them, that they had been just a routine classroom assignment, and that she saw no reason to keep them permanently. But Mary Patterson was certain she had seen Miss Holloway reading papers from a folder just weeks after James's death, papers that Mary had assumed were the obituaries. When Mary pressed Holloway about this, Holloway became defensive and angry, telling Mary that it was inappropriate to question a teacher's judgment about classroom materials and that Mary was allowing grief to make her paranoid and suspicious. The confrontation ended with Mary leaving the school unsatisfied, but having no evidence or authority to pursue the matter further. Other parents, hearing about Mary Patterson's concerns, began asking their children if they remembered what they had written in their obituaries. Some children could recall general details that they had written about dying young, or about specific diseases, or about accidents, but most children's memories of the specific ages and circumstances they had predicted were vague or non-existent. The children had written the obituaries a year earlier, had not thought about them since, and could not reliably remember what they had written even when questioned by anxious parents trying to determine if their children were at risk. Several parents approached Reverend Thomas Morrison, the Baptist minister who served the Hillsborough community, asking him to speak with Miss Holloway about the deaths and about the obituary assignment that seemed connected to them. Morrison was initially skeptical, viewing the concerns as the product of grief and of people's tendency to see patterns in random events. But as he reviewed his own records of funerals he had conducted and compared them to school enrollment records, Morrison was disturbed to realize that every child who had died over the past year had been enrolled in Miss Holloway's class and had presumably completed the obituary assignment. Morrison visited Miss Holloway in October 1920 expressing concern about the deaths and asking if there was any connection between the obituary assignment and the students who had died. Holloway reacted with anger and offense, telling Morrison that it was disgraceful to suggest that a classroom writing exercise could cause children's deaths, that the deaths were tragic coincidences resulting from the poverty and limited medical care that affected rural communities, and that attempting to connect a teacher's innocent assignment to natural deaths was both irrational and cruel. Morrison left the meeting troubled but uncertain. Holloway's explanation seemed logical. Childhood mortality was tragically common in rural Tennessee in 1920, and parents looking for someone to blame for their losses might fixate on any unusual event that had occurred before the deaths. But the specific correlation between predicted ages and causes of death and actual ages and causes seemed to exceed what coincidence could explain. Morrison began keeping more detailed records, noting each student death and checking whether the deceased child had been in Holloway's class during the 1919-20 school year when the obituary assignment had been given. By December 1920, 15 months after the obituary assignment, 12 students were dead. The community was reeling from the losses, with multiple families grieving children, and with increasing suspicion that something more than natural causes was at work. Several families removed their surviving children from Holloway's school, choosing to keep them home or to send them to a school in a neighboring community, several miles away. The Hillsborough School's enrollment dropped from 23 to 11 students, with all 12 who had died, and several living students whose parents had withdrawn them, leaving the school nearly empty. In January 1921, Reverend Morrison traveled to Nashville to meet with the Williamson County Sheriff, presenting his records documenting the pattern of student deaths and asking for official investigation into whether crimes might have been committed. The sheriff, Thomas Whitfield, was initially dismissive, viewing Morrison's concerns as superstitious worry about coincidental deaths. But when Morrison presented the statistical improbability of 12 students all dying at ages they had specifically predicted in writing assignments, Whitfield agreed to at least review the circumstances of the deaths to determine if further investigation was warranted. Whitfield sent a deputy to Hillsborough to interview families of deceased students, to review death certificates, and to speak with the doctor who had treated several of the children before their deaths. The deputy's report, submitted in February 1921, found no evidence of foul play in any individual death. The causes listed on death certificates, drowning, disease, accidents, were all plausible and consistent with the symptoms and circumstances that families and the doctor described. There was no physical evidence suggesting that anyone had deliberately caused any of the deaths, no common factor linking them except that all the deceased children had attended the same school. But the report also noted the disturbing correlation between predicted and actual ages and causes of death, acknowledged that the pattern exceeded what chance would normally produce, and recommended continued monitoring to determine if additional deaths occurred and if they continued to match the pattern. Whitfield decided against formal criminal investigation, as there was no evidence of crimes and no clear mechanism by which a teacher could have caused such diverse deaths through such varied means. But he directed his deputies to pay attention to any further deaths of Holloway's students and to report them immediately. The deaths continued through 1921, though at a slower pace than they had in 1920. In March, a student died from influenza complications at the age she had predicted. In June, another student drowned in circumstances that matched his written obituary. In September, a student was killed in a farming accident that precisely matched the scenario he had described in his writing. By November 1921, 20 of the 23 students who had written obituaries were dead, with only 3 still living, 2 girls ages 8 and 10, and 1 boy aged 12. The 3 surviving students and their families lived in constant fear that the pattern would complete itself, that these children would also die at the ages and from the causes they had written about in their obituaries. But none of the families could remember exactly what their children had written. The children had been 6, 8, and 10 years old when they completed the assignment 2 years earlier, and their memories of what they had written were too vague to provide clear predictions of what deaths might still be coming. The families considered leaving Hillsborough entirely, moving to other communities where whatever curse or danger seemed to affect Holloway's students might not be able to reach them. But poverty and lack of resources made relocation difficult or impossible for tenant farming families who had no savings and no opportunities elsewhere. In December 1921, the final 3 predicted deaths occurred within a 10-day period. The 8-year-old girl died from pneumonia on December 30. The 12-year-old boy was killed in a barn fire on December 9. The 10-year-old girl died from typhoid fever on December 13. All three deaths occurred at ages and from causes that, according to Reverend Morrison's interviews with parents and with surviving students who had been classmates, matched what those children had written in their obituaries more than 2 years earlier. With all 23 students now dead, the community's fear and suspicion focused entirely on Margaret Holloway. It seemed impossible that natural causes could explain 23 deaths that matched written predictions so precisely. Parents who had lost children demanded that Holloway be investigated, that her school be closed, that she be removed from teaching and possibly prosecuted for whatever role she had played in the deaths. But what crime could she be charged with? What evidence existed that she had done anything beyond giving a writing assignment and then apparently keeping the papers and reading them repeatedly? Sheriff Whitfield returned to Hillsborough in January 1922 to conduct a more thorough investigation now that all the predicted deaths had occurred. He interviewed Holloway at length, asking her to explain the correlation between the obituary assignment and the student deaths. Holloway maintained that the correlation was coincidence, that children in rural Tennessee died frequently from disease and accident, and that any group of 23 children followed for 2 years would likely include multiple deaths. She argued that the apparent specificity of predictions matching actual deaths was the result of confirmation bias and selective memory, that people remembered predictions that had come true while forgetting or downplaying cases where predictions hadn't matched reality. But when pressed about specific cases where predictions had matched deaths with precision, James Patterson drowning while trying to save another child, Robert Collins dying in a barn fire, Sarah Mitchell dying from fever at 13, Holloway could not explain how multiple such precise predictions could all be coincidences. She became increasingly defensive and agitated during questioning, finally refusing to answer further questions and telling Whitfield that she had done nothing wrong and would not be persecuted for the natural deaths of children who had been her students. Whitfield searched Holloway's house and classroom, looking for the obituaries that students had written or for any other evidence that might explain the deaths. He found nothing incriminating, no papers that appeared to be the student obituaries, no poisons or weapons that could have been used to cause deaths, no journals or writings in which Holloway described planning or executing murders. Holloway's personal belongings were few and unremarkable. Her house was neat and orderly, and there was nothing that suggested criminal activity or dangerous intent. But Whitfield did find something disturbing in Holloway's bedroom, a Bible that Holloway had apparently annotated extensively, with particular focus on passages about death, judgment, and divine will. Holloway had underlined verses about God knowing the number of each person's days, about death coming like a thief in the night, about children being called home to God. In the margins next to these verses, Holloway had written notes that seemed to interpret these passages as meaning that some people had special knowledge about when others would die, that this knowledge came from God, and that sharing or acting on this knowledge was fulfilling divine will rather than committing murder. These annotations suggested that Holloway believed she had some special relationship with death, some ability to know or influence when people would die, but they did not constitute evidence of criminal activity. Believing one has prophetic knowledge or divine insight is not a crime, even if such beliefs are delusional, and without evidence that Holloway had actually caused any of the deaths, without poison found in her possession, without witnesses seeing her harm any children, without any mechanism by which she could have orchestrated such diverse deaths through such varied means, Whitfield could not arrest or charge her with any crime. The community was unsatisfied with this outcome. Parents who had lost children believed Holloway had murdered them even if the mechanism remained mysterious. They demanded that she at least be removed from teaching, that the school board dismiss her and ensure she never had access to children again. But the school board, which consisted of several property-owning farmers who had limited sympathy with tenant farming families' concerns, was reluctant to dismiss a teacher without evidence of wrongdoing or incompetence. Holloway was educated, experienced, and had generally produced satisfactory educational outcomes before the mysterious deaths began. Without proof that she had harmed students, dismissing her could expose the school board to legal liability for wrongful termination. The compromise reached was that Holloway would resign voluntarily, receiving a modest financial settlement and a neutral reference letter that would not mention the circumstances of her departure. Holloway accepted this arrangement in March 1922, perhaps recognizing that her position in Hillsborough had become untenable regardless of her guilt or innocence. She left Tennessee entirely, moving to Kentucky, where she found work as a private tutor for wealthy families whose children were educated at home rather than in schools. Her subsequent teaching career was apparently uneventful, with no mysterious deaths or unusual incidents reported from families she worked for. Holloway died in 1938 at age 61, having never married and having lived alone throughout her life. Her death was from natural causes, heart failure, and was unremarkable except for the mystery that surrounded her Tennessee teaching years. Holloway never publicly addressed the deaths of her 23 students, never offered any explanation beyond asserting that they were natural tragedies, unconnected to her obituary assignment, and apparently took whatever knowledge or involvement she had to her grave. The investigation into the 23 deaths officially concluded in April 1922 with Sheriff Whitfield's final report, stating that while the pattern of deaths was statistically unusual and disturbing, no evidence of criminal activity could be established. The deaths were classified as resulting from natural causes and accidents, with the correlation to the obituary assignment noted as an unexplained coincidence that might warrant further study by medical or statistical experts, but that did not constitute grounds for criminal prosecution. But the community of Hillsborough never accepted this conclusion. For decades afterward, residents believed that Margaret Holloway had somehow murdered 23 children, that she had used the obituary assignment to select victims and to plan their deaths, and that she had escaped justice through some combination of cleverness in execution and limitations of early 20th century forensic investigation. Stories about Holloway and her cursed obituary assignment became local legend, told to children as cautionary tales about the dangers of trusting the wrong people and about evil that can hide behind respectable appearances. The one-room schoolhouse where Holloway had taught was closed permanently in 1923, with remaining school-aged children in Hillsborough sent to schools in neighboring communities. The building stood abandoned for several years, becoming associated in local folklore with death and bad luck, before finally being torn down in 1928. The land where it had stood remained empty for decades, with no one willing to build on a site associated with such tragedy. Even today, over a century later, locals who know the history avoid the area and tell stories about the teacher who made children write their own obituaries and then made those predictions come true. The question of how to explain the deaths remains debated. The skeptical explanation is that the correlation between obituaries and deaths was largely coincidental, that childhood mortality was so common in 1920s rural Tennessee that any group of 23 children followed for 2 years would include multiple deaths, and that the apparent specificity of matching predictions was the result of confirmation bias, selective memory, and people's tendency to interpret ambiguous predictions as matching outcomes when they want to find patterns. This explanation suggests that perhaps only a few predictions truly match their outcomes precisely, while most matches were approximate or required generous interpretation to seem accurate. But this skeptical explanation struggles to account for the most precise matches. Cases like James Patterson drowning at age 11 while trying to save another child, or Robert Collins dying in a barn fire at age 15, where the predictions matched outcomes so specifically that coincidence seems inadequate as explanation. Even allowing for confirmation bias and selective memory, the statistical improbability of multiple such precise matches suggests that something beyond chance was at work. An alternative explanation is that the children somehow had genuine precognitive knowledge when they wrote their obituaries, that they experienced visions or intuitions about their own deaths, that they expressed in the writing assignment without consciously recognizing them as predictions. This explanation would require accepting that precognition is real and that young children can access such knowledge even when they don't understand what they're experiencing. While such paranormal explanations are unsatisfying to rationalists, they would account for the precision of matches between predictions and outcomes without requiring that anyone deliberately cause the deaths. The most disturbing explanation is that Margaret Holloway did somehow cause the deaths, that she read the obituaries students had written, and then orchestrated circumstances that would make those predictions come true. But this explanation requires accepting that Holloway had extraordinary criminal sophistication and opportunity, that she could cause drownings, diseases, fires, and accidents in ways that left no physical evidence, and that didn't require her presence at the scenes of death. It requires believing that she could poison water supplies or food sources to cause diseases, that she could weaken structures or sabotage equipment to cause accidents, that she could do all this without being noticed or caught, despite being under suspicion, and despite multiple investigations. Some researchers have suggested a middle possibility, that Holloway didn't cause all the deaths directly, but that she influenced some of them through suggestion and psychological manipulation. Perhaps Holloway told certain students that they would die as they had written, planting seeds of expectation that led the children to take risks or to give up fighting illnesses in ways that made their predicted deaths self-fulfilling. Perhaps Holloway shared predictions with people in the community in subtle ways, creating expectations that influenced how accidents occurred or how illnesses were treated. This explanation doesn't require Holloway to have been a super criminal capable of orchestrating murders across diverse methods, but it still requires her to have been deliberately malevolent and to have consciously worked to make children's predictions come true. The psychological question of why Holloway would want to kill her students, if she did kill them, remains as mysterious as the question of how she might have accomplished it. Holloway had no obvious motive. She gained nothing financially from the deaths, had no apparent grudges against specific families, showed no signs of the sadism or desire for power that motivates many serial killers. If she killed her students, the motive seems to have been purely ideological or delusional, perhaps connected to her religious beliefs about divine will and about some people knowing the number of others' days. Holloway's annotated Bible, with its focus on passages about death being predetermined and about special people having knowledge of when others would die, suggests she may have believed she had a divine calling to serve as an instrument of God's will in determining when children would die. Perhaps she viewed the obituary assignment as a way of identifying which children God had chosen to die young, and perhaps she believed she was doing holy work by ensuring that God's will was fulfilled at the times and in the ways the children had unknowingly predicted. This delusion, if it was what motivated her, would make her similar to religious killers who believe they're carrying out divine commands, though Holloway's methods and her concealment of her role would distinguish her from most such killers who typically announce their actions as holy work. The families of the 23 dead students struggled for the rest of their lives with grief compounded by uncertainty about what had actually happened to their children. Were the deaths natural tragedies that happened to correlate with written predictions by coincidence? Were they the result of genuine precognition that gave children doomed knowledge of their own deaths? Or were they murders committed by a teacher who used a writing assignment to select victims and plan their deaths? The absence of definitive answers left families unable to achieve closure, unable to decide whether to remember their children as victims of fate or as murder victims whose killer had escaped justice. Several families moved away from Hillsborough after the deaths, unable to continue living in a community that reminded them constantly of their losses and of the mystery surrounding those losses. Other families remained but became insular and suspicious, trusting no one outside their immediate circles, and viewing education and outside authority with deep skepticism. The trauma affected not just parents who had lost children, but also siblings who survived, who grew up knowing their brothers or sisters had died under mysterious circumstances, who sometimes felt guilt about surviving when so many others had died. Reverend Thomas Morrison, who had first noticed the pattern of deaths and who had pushed for investigation despite resistance from authorities, was affected deeply by the case and by his inability to protect the community's children or to bring justice for those who had died. Morrison continued serving the Hillsborough Baptist Church until his death in 1945, but he was reportedly changed by the experience, becoming more somber and less confident in his faith and in God's protection of the innocent. Morrison's sermons, in the years following the deaths, often focused on themes of unexplained suffering, on the limitations of human understanding, and on questions about why God allows evil to harm children. The case attracted attention from researchers interested in paranormal phenomena, in serial murder, and in unusual death patterns. Several investigators visited Hillsborough in the 1920s and 1930s, attempting to study the case more thoroughly, but they found that community members were reluctant to discuss the events, that records had been lost or destroyed, and that memories had become confused or contaminated by decades of speculation and storytelling. The case was documented in several books about unexplained phenomena and about serial killers, but these accounts often contained errors or embellishments that made it difficult to separate fact from legend. Modern researchers reviewing the case have been limited by gaps in documentation and by the passage of time that makes verification of specific claims impossible. Original school records from Hillsborough were lost in a fire in 1932 that destroyed the courthouse where they had been stored. Death certificates exist for most of the 23 students, but provide only basic information about causes and dates of death, without the detail that would be needed to assess whether deaths truly matched written predictions precisely. Reverend Morrison's personal records, which apparently contained the most detailed documentation of the correlation between obituaries and deaths, were never found after his death, and may have been destroyed by family members who wanted to protect his reputation, or who found the material too disturbing to preserve. The 3 students who survived Margaret Holloway's class despite having written obituaries, the 3 whose predicted deaths apparently didn't occur or occurred at different ages or from different causes than they had written, were interviewed decades later by researchers attempting to understand the pattern. All 3 reported having written obituaries, but couldn't remember specific details about what they had predicted. They expressed relief at having survived, but also guilt and confusion about why they had been spared when 23 classmates had died. None of them could explain why their predictions hadn't come true if the pattern was genuine, and none had any insight into whether Holloway had done something to cause the other deaths or whether some other factor had protected them from fates that had claimed their classmates. One of the 3 survivors, a woman named Elizabeth Carter, who had been 8 years old during Holloway's class, reported in a 1965 interview that she had always felt that she had written something very different in her obituary than what her classmates had written, though she couldn't remember specifics. She recalled that while other students had written about dying young from disease or accident, she had written that she would live to be very old and would die peacefully surrounded by family. Whether this difference in prediction explained her survival, whether Holloway only targeted students who had written about dying young, or whether students who predicted long lives were somehow protected by their own expectations, cannot be determined from available evidence. The psychological impact on survivors of knowing that their classmates had apparently predicted and then experienced their own deaths was profound and lasting. Several survivors reported experiencing anxiety about death throughout their lives, feeling that death might come for them unexpectedly as it had for their classmates, wondering if they too had somehow known their fates when they wrote their obituaries but had simply been given more time. Some survivors became superstitious, avoiding activities or situations that might match anything they had written in their childhood obituaries, trying to prevent predictions from coming true, even though they couldn't remember what they had predicted. The broader question of how common it is for people to accurately predict their own deaths, whether through intuition, precognition, or simply through understanding their own risk factors, has been studied by parapsychology researchers and by psychologists interested in self-fulfilling prophecies. While there are anecdotal reports of people having premonitions of their deaths that proved accurate, systematic study has found no evidence that most people have any reliable ability to predict when or how they will die. The Holloway case, if the correlations between obituaries and deaths were genuine and not the result of selective memory or confirmation bias, would represent an extraordinary cluster of accurate death predictions that far exceeds what statistical chance would produce. Some researchers have suggested that the Holloway case might demonstrate not precognition, but rather the power of suggestion and self-fulfilling prophecy, operating at a community level. Perhaps after James Patterson's death matched his written obituary, community members began paying closer attention to subsequent deaths and began interpreting them as matching predictions, even when the matches were approximate. Perhaps families of students who had written about dying from fever became more fatalistic when their children developed fevers, giving up on treatment more quickly because they believed death was predetermined. Perhaps students who remembered writing about dying in accidents became more careless or took more risks because they believed their fates were sealed. This explanation would account for apparent correlations without requiring either impossible precognition or sophisticated murder orchestration by Holloway. But this social psychological explanation struggles to account for the most precise matches, particularly cases where the manner of death involved circumstances that individuals couldn't easily influence or create through their own behavior. A child writing about drowning while saving another child could not easily create that scenario through self-fulfilling prophecy. It would require specific circumstances, including another person being in danger at the right time and place. A child writing about dying in a barn fire, similarly, could not easily bring about that specific scenario unless they deliberately set the fire themselves, which investigation showed had not occurred in any of the cases. The question of Margaret Holloway's actual role and motivations remains the central mystery of the case. If she was innocent, if the deaths were natural tragedies that happened to correlate with written predictions by chance or through some paranormal mechanism, then she was victimized by suspicious community members who blamed her for losses that grieved everyone. Her forced resignation and her flight from Tennessee would have been unjust punishments for someone whose only crime was giving an unusual writing assignment that coincidentally preceded a cluster of deaths. But if she was guilty, if she somehow caused or facilitated the deaths, then her escape from prosecution represents a failure of justice and a victory for a serial killer who used children's own words against them, making their imagined deaths real through methods clever enough to avoid detection. The annotated Bible found in her possession, with its focus on predetermined death and on special people knowing when others would die, suggests at minimum that Holloway had an unhealthy preoccupation with death, and possibly that she had rationalized murder as fulfilling divine will. The absence of the original obituaries that students wrote makes definitive analysis of the case impossible. If those papers still existed, modern researchers could assess exactly what each student had written, could compare predictions to actual outcomes systematically rather than relying on fragmentary memories and second-hand accounts, and could determine whether the correlations were as precise and numerous as community legend suggests. The fact that Holloway claimed to have thrown away the obituaries shortly after the assignment was completed, despite multiple witnesses seeing her reading papers from a folder months and years later, suggests she had reason to destroy evidence that might have revealed her guilt or that might have demonstrated the impossibility of natural explanations for the death pattern. The impact of the case on educational practices in rural Tennessee was significant. School boards throughout the region became more cautious about hiring unmarried women teachers, particularly those who had unconventional teaching methods, or who seemed too interested in morbid topics. Parents became more involved in monitoring what assignments their children were given, and more willing to question or challenge teachers whose methods seemed unusual. Some school districts banned any assignments involving death or dying, fearing that such assignments might either predict or cause student deaths, even though no rational mechanism for such causation could be identified. These reactions, while understandable as responses to community trauma, had some negative consequences for education. Restricting teachers to conventional methods and traditional assignments limited students' exposure to creative thinking and to subjects that might be uncomfortable but educationally valuable. Discriminating against unmarried women teachers reinforced gender and marital status stereotypes that already limited women's professional opportunities, and the superstitious fear that certain assignments might cause deaths diverted attention from actual threats to children's health and safety, including poverty, malnutrition, inadequate medical care, and dangerous working conditions that killed far more children than any teacher's assignment could have. The case also contributed to broader cultural anxiety about education and about the influence that teachers could have over children entrusted to their care. In the early 20th century, formal education was expanding in rural areas, with more children attending school for longer periods, and with trained teachers replacing informal community-based education. This transition created opportunities, but also anxieties. Parents who had little formal education themselves worried about teachers filling their children's heads with ideas or values that conflicted with family traditions, about children being exposed to influences that parents couldn't control or monitor, about the power that educated outsiders might exercise over vulnerable children. The Holloway case activated these anxieties, suggesting that teachers might not just influence children's thinking, but might actually threaten their survival. Whether or not Holloway had actually harmed her students, the belief that she had done so reinforced suspicions about educated women, about progressive teaching methods, and about formal education generally. These suspicions persisted for decades in some rural Tennessee communities, making it difficult for subsequent teachers to gain trust and making some families reluctant to send children to school even when education might have improved their economic prospects. The legal and investigative limitations revealed by the Holloway case also prompted some reforms in how suspicious death patterns were handled. Prior to this case, child deaths in rural areas were rarely investigated thoroughly, with officials generally accepting family and physician accounts of natural causes unless there was obvious evidence of violence or neglect. But the Holloway case demonstrated that serial murders could occur without obvious violence, that patterns visible only through statistical analysis might reveal crimes that individual cases would miss, and that investigators needed training and resources to identify and respond to such patterns. Some law enforcement agencies began keeping better records of child deaths, began looking for correlations and patterns that might indicate abuse or murder rather than just natural causes, and began developing procedures for investigating suspicious death clusters even when individual deaths appeared natural. These reforms were modest and implementation was inconsistent, but they represented recognition that protecting children required more sophisticated investigation than simply accepting that childhood mortality was tragically common. The memorial for the 23 students who died between 1919 and 1921 was created in 1950 by descendants and by community members who wanted to ensure the children were remembered. A simple stone monument was erected in the Hillsborough Cemetery, listing the names of all 23 students, their birth and death dates, and a brief inscription: "Taken too soon. Remembered always. Their deaths a mystery that time has not solved." The monument became a focal point for annual memorial services held on the anniversary of Margaret Holloway's obituary assignment, with families gathering to remember the children and to acknowledge the tragedy that had devastated the community. These annual services continued for several decades, gradually diminishing as the generation that had lived through the events died and as the community's active memory of the tragedy faded. By the 1980s, the memorial services had stopped, though the monument remained and occasionally received flowers from descendants or from people who had learned about the case and who came to pay respects to the children who had died under such mysterious circumstances. The case has been revisited periodically by journalists and researchers, particularly during anniversary years, but new information has rarely emerged. Most of the people who knew Margaret Holloway personally are long dead. The physical evidence that might have resolved questions about her guilt or innocence has been lost or destroyed, and the passage of time has made it impossible to verify many of the claims about specific correlations between predicted and actual deaths. The case remains suspended between natural tragedy and unsolved serial murder, between coincidence and conspiracy, between rational explanation and paranormal mystery. Modern true crime enthusiasts and paranormal investigators who study the Holloway case typically fall into one of three camps. Some argue that she was clearly a serial killer who used the obituary assignment to select victims and plan murders, that her escape from prosecution was due to primitive forensic methods and to biases that made investigators reluctant to believe a respectable female teacher could be a mass murderer. Others argue that the case has been sensationalized, that most of the claimed correlations between obituaries and deaths were either coincidental or exaggerated through decades of retelling, and that Holloway was innocent of anything beyond giving an unfortunately timed assignment before a cluster of natural deaths. A third group argues that the case represents genuine paranormal phenomena, that the children experienced precognition when writing their obituaries, that they genuinely saw their own futures, and that their deaths were fated rather than caused by either natural circumstances or by Holloway's actions. None of these interpretations can be proven definitively with available evidence, and each requires accepting some uncomfortable implications. The serial killer interpretation requires believing that a woman with no obvious motive and limited means somehow orchestrated 23 deaths through diverse methods without leaving evidence. The coincidence interpretation requires accepting that statistical improbability occurred, that multiple precise matches between predictions and outcomes happen by chance in ways that far exceed normal probability. The paranormal interpretation requires accepting that precognition is real and that multiple children access this ability simultaneously when writing a classroom assignment. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that the Holloway case represents a genuine mystery, an event that cannot be fully explained by any single theory and that remains disturbing precisely because it resists definitive interpretation. 23 children died between 1919 and 1921 after writing obituaries that appeared to predict their deaths. Whether those deaths were natural, whether they were murders, whether they were somehow fated or predicted through impossible means, cannot be determined with certainty more than a century after the events occurred. The psychological impact of the case extended beyond the Hillsborough community to affect how people thought about fate, free will, and the power of words. The idea that writing about death might cause death, that putting predictions on paper might make them come true, created anxiety about expression and about the potential consequences of imagining bad outcomes. Some people became superstitious about discussing their own deaths, or about thinking too carefully about how they might die, fearing that such thoughts might become self-fulfilling prophecies. This anxiety connected to broader cultural beliefs about the power of words and thoughts to shape reality, beliefs that appear in various religious and philosophical traditions, and that suggest conscious thought and language might influence outcomes in ways that go beyond simple cause and effect. The Holloway case seemed to validate these beliefs, suggesting that children's written words had somehow determined their fates, or at least had predicted fates that were already determined, creating a disturbing convergence of imagination and reality that challenged materialist assumptions about how the world works. The case also raised questions about responsibility and guilt, that go beyond simply determining whether Holloway had committed murders. Even if she had not directly caused any deaths, was she morally responsible for giving an assignment that might have planted suggestions that influenced outcomes? If children who wrote about dying young became more fatalistic or careless in ways that contributed to their deaths, did Holloway bear some responsibility for creating those psychological conditions? Or was she innocent of any wrongdoing, having simply given a writing assignment that happened to precede tragic events through no fault of her own? These moral and philosophical questions have no clear answers, and different people respond to them according to their broader beliefs about causation, responsibility, and the power of suggestion. But the questions remain important for thinking about how educators and others in authority positions should exercise care in what they say to children, how they frame assignments and activities, and whether they should avoid topics or approaches that might create harmful expectations or beliefs, even if no direct physical harm is intended or likely. The 3 survivors of Holloway's class lived out their lives carrying the burden of having survived when so many classmates had died. They were interviewed periodically by researchers and journalists, asked repeatedly to remember details from events that occurred in their early childhoods and that they had spent decades trying to forget or process. These interviews were often traumatic, forcing survivors to relive losses and fears that they had managed to set aside, requiring them to speculate about why they had survived when others hadn't, making them question whether they owed their survival to luck, to having written different predictions, or to some other factor they couldn't identify. All 3 survivors expressed conflicted feelings about the attention the case received. They wanted the 23 children who had died to be remembered, wanted their stories preserved and their losses acknowledged. But they also wanted privacy for themselves and their families, wanted to move beyond being defined by a childhood trauma, wanted to live normal lives without constantly being questioned about events they barely remembered and couldn't explain. The tension between these desires, between honoring the dead and protecting the living, reflects broader challenges in how we remember tragedies and how we balance historical documentation with respect for survivors' needs. The site where the Hillsborough one-room schoolhouse once stood is now an empty field, the building having been demolished in 1928 and no structure having been built in its place. Local people avoid the site, considering it unlucky or haunted, and the land has remained undeveloped despite being suitable for construction. The absence of any marker or memorial at the actual site means that most people who pass through the area have no idea that a schoolhouse once stood there, or that 23 children who attended that school died under mysterious circumstances. This erasure from the physical landscape reflects a broader pattern of how communities deal with tragedies they cannot fully understand or resolve, by removing reminders, by forgetting when possible, by moving forward rather than dwelling on events that offer no closure or comfort. But the absence of physical markers doesn't mean the events have been forgotten entirely. They persist in family stories, in local legends, in occasional media coverage, and in the historical record that documents a pattern of deaths that remains disturbing and unexplained more than a century after it occurred. Margaret Holloway's grave in Kentucky, where she was buried after her death in 1938, bears a simple headstone with her name and dates, and no reference to her teaching career or to the controversy that had ended her time in Tennessee. Whether this lack of detail reflects Holloway's wishes, her family's desire to protect her reputation, or simply standard practice for marking graves, is unknown. The grave receives no visitors, and most people who see it in passing have no idea who Margaret Holloway was or what role she may have played in the deaths of 23 children. The 23 students, who died between 1919 and 1921, are buried in various cemeteries throughout Williamson County, Tennessee, their graves marked with small stones that typically include only names and dates without details about how they died or about the mysterious pattern that connected their deaths. A few graves include biblical verses or simple statements that the children are with Jesus or called home too soon, but most are unmarked or have weathered markers that are barely legible after a century of exposure to Tennessee weather. These children's lives were cut short before they could accomplish much beyond childhood, before they could form families or pursue careers or make contributions to their communities. They are remembered primarily as victims, as statistics in an unsolved mystery, rather than as individuals with their own personalities, dreams, and potential. This reduction of human lives to elements in a mystery story is perhaps an additional tragedy beyond the deaths themselves, that these children's identities have been overshadowed by the circumstances of their deaths and by debates about what those circumstances mean. What do you think happened in that Tennessee schoolhouse? Did Margaret Holloway murder 23 students using methods that left no evidence? Did the children somehow predict their own deaths through genuine precognition? Were the correlations between obituaries and deaths the result of coincidence magnified by confirmation bias? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this investigation compelling, subscribe to Shadows of America. We release documentaries like this every day at 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. EST. Hit that like button, share this video, and let us know what state you're watching from. The past is never truly buried. It's just waiting in the shadows.